All right, guys, I was hoping that I didn't have to do this, but I'm going to sound a little bit different in this video simply because earlier this week I underwent an oral surgery and I'm still recovering from it. So it's really hard for me to talk right now, but I wanted to get this review out to you guys. I can't really talk the way I normally do, and I can't talk that loudly either. It's really uncomfortable. So I just want to throw that out there so you guys are aware and you're not wondering why I sound a little bit different or why my speech is a little bit weird, so to speak. So that's it. Anyways, let's get into it. I hope you guys enjoy the review of the OnePlus 3T. From a design standpoint, it looks exactly the same as the original OnePlus 3. It's a full metal unibody design with a slightly curved backside, rounded corners and sides, and because the back tapers along the edges, it allows the phone to feel a lot thinner. Despite being made almost entirely of metal, it's surprisingly lightweight, making the phone feel very comfortable to hold. It's also not a very wide or tall phone, so it's pretty manageable to use in one hand even with its fairly large 5.5-inch screen size, and it's only slightly larger than Samsung's S7 Edge, which also has the same screen size. There's no 3T logo or anything on this phone that will explicitly tell you that this is the 3T, and the only way to know that it is a 3T is by the color. The 3T comes in two colors. You have the same gold color that was on the original OnePlus 3, but with the 3T, you have a gunmetal version instead of silver. The gunmetal version is going to be the more expensive model since it comes with 128 gigs of internal storage, whereas the gold version will be slightly less expensive with 64 gigs of internal storage. So with the phone being made of a unibody metal design, it's obvious that build quality is not an issue here, and everything feels very high quality, including the buttons and ports. You have the power button on the right side, volume rocker on the left side, and OnePlus's very useful notification slider right above that lets you quickly toggle between silent, do not disturb, and full volume, and all the buttons feel very tactile and easy to press. There's no headphone jack up top or anything up top for that matter, but there is a headphone jack on the bottom, along with your USB Type-C port, and a series of machine drilled holes for the single bottom firing speaker. On the front is the fingerprint sensor / home button flanked by capacitive keys for back and recent apps, but you do have the option to switch to on-screen keys if that's what you prefer. By default, the back keys is on the left and recent apps is on the right, but you can flip it the other way around in the settings and also add in a variety of long press or double tap functions to the home button or capacitive keys. While the fingerprint sensor itself is very fast to unlock, it's not the most accurate fingerprint sensor that I've ever used and will often misread my fingerprint several times throughout the day. I didn't find it to be that big of an issue because overall it's still a fairly reliable fingerprint sensor. The 5.5-inch screen remains unchanged from the OnePlus 3. It's still 1080p, but it's one of the best 1080p panels on the market. It's AMOLED, so colors are rich and vibrant with tons of contrast, and Oxygen OS's optional dark mode looks fantastic with the AMOLED's inky deep blacks. If you're not a fan of the vibrancy, OnePlus has made it really easy to switch to the sRGB color mode under the display settings for a more natural, less saturated look. It's pretty bright, so it's easily visible outdoors, and the screen still looks plenty sharp. To the naked eye, you most likely won't be able to see the difference between this and a Quad HD panel unless you're using the phone for VR. OnePlus feels that mobile VR hasn't quite caught on to the mainstream yet, so they opted to keep the 1080p resolution in favor of better battery life. Speaking of battery life, this is one area that got a small spec bump. It's now a 3400 mAh battery over the 3000 mAh battery on the original OnePlus 3, so you're looking at a 13% increase in battery capacity, all without making the phone any thicker or heavier than the OnePlus 3. You get OnePlus's own dash charging technology, and the biggest benefit to this is that the majority of the heat generated during charging is contained in the wall adapter instead of reaching your phone. This also means they can use your phone heavily while it's charging without worrying about the charging speeds throttling down in order to control heat. OnePlus claims that you can get a full day's charge in half an hour, which basically translates to a 60% charge from a completely dead phone, which is pretty impressive and should work out perfectly fine if you just need to top off for a long night ahead. In day-to-day use, battery life for me has been extremely good. It easily lasts me all day, even with my heavy usage of a lot of gaming, YouTube watching, and music streaming per day. And even though the bump in battery capacity was relatively minor, it seems to be making a very significant difference to the phone's overall battery life. Another area that saw an improvement is in performance. It has a whopping 6 GB of RAM, just like the OnePlus 3, but the processor has been upgraded to the Snapdragon 821, and this is the 2.35 GHz version, which is clocked higher than the one found in Google's own Pixel phones. General performance on the 3T has been really great, and again, having a 1080p display helps out a lot here since the processor isn't having to push as many pixels, even though it's perfectly capable of doing so. It's very fast to open apps, has excellent touch response, and runs all the high-end games without any choppiness or frame drops, and with 6 GB of RAM, multitasking isn't an issue either. It can hold a ton of apps in memory and keeps them there for a very long time. It's one of the smoothest and quickest Android experiences out there. I wouldn't say it's Google Pixel smooth, but it's definitely up there with the best of them. A lot of the phone's smooth performance also has to do with the software. In typical OnePlus fashion, this is running a newer version of Oxygen OS based on Android Marshmallow at the moment, and it has a very stock Android look and feel, but with a ton of customizations that add to the experience without getting in the way. You still have Shelf one swipe away on the leftmost home screen for checking the weather, composing memos, viewing your recent contacts or apps, and managing your data, storage, and battery life. This updated version of Oxygen OS has also introduced some new features to further refine the experience. You can now swipe down on the screen with 3 fingers to take a screenshot, lock down any applications of your choice to require a password or fingerprint in order to access them, and despite being on Marshmallow, OnePlus has updated the notification shade to the Nougat style notification shade with the one swipe down quick toggles. OnePlus hasn't given an exact date as to when the 3T will get Nougat, but it's slated to happen before the end of the year for both the 3 and the 3T. The last area that saw a significant change from the OnePlus 3 to the 3T is with the camera, but this change is actually on the front camera. The front camera is now a 16 megapixel sensor, so double the megapixel count from the 8 megapixels on the OnePlus 3. It's f2.0 aperture, which helps out a lot for taking low light selfies, and it's pretty great for taking selfies in general. With the bump in megapixel count, you'll have a lot more room to zoom and crop without deteriorating the picture's quality and get much sharper looking front-facing video. The rear camera is the same 16 megapixel Sony sensor with optical image stabilization and phase detection autofocus, and yes, it still has a camera hump just like before, but since the lens is covered in sapphire glass, you shouldn't have to worry about it getting scratched up. The camera app itself is pretty similar to Google's with many of the same modes like time-lapse, slow motion, and panorama. The only exception is it has manual controls if you want to dial in the settings yourself, but otherwise it's a very nicely laid out and easy to use camera app. It's definitely a good camera when it comes to picture quality. The photos that it takes are crisp and well detailed, and I really like the color reproduction. They're very nice, natural looking colors, and the images are sharp enough without looking over sharpened. If you want some extra sharpening, you can use the camera's high quality mode, which adds a fairly noticeable amount of sharpening to the photos, but I thought the photos in most situations looked fine as they were, so I rarely ever use this feature. In terms of dynamic range, I do think this camera has a tendency to overexpose and blow out highlights, but HDR mode fixes this pretty easily, and it does a great job of pulling out extra detail from the highlights and shadows, while still maintaining a natural look of the original image. Low light shots can be pretty good, but only if you're using the camera's high quality mode. Without it, the images are very noisy and soft, but with it enabled, the images are much sharper, more detailed, and a lot cleaner. With an increase in battery capacity, a faster processor, and an improved front-facing camera, this also results in an increase in price. You're looking at $439 for the 64GB model and $479 for the 128GB model, which is an increase of $40 to $80 over the $400 price tag of the OnePlus 3. It'll be available starting November 22nd for the US and November 28th for Europe, and considering the bump in specs on the 3T, the price difference is completely justifiable. It's not that huge of a price hike and still undercuts a lot of other flagships. So should you get the OnePlus 3T, and if you're currently on the OnePlus 3, should you upgrade? If you're on the OnePlus 3, you shouldn't feel compelled to upgrade to the 3T because while the improvements are really nice, it doesn't drastically change the overall experience from the 3 to the 3T. And if you're concerned about software updates, both of these phones will be receiving their updates simultaneously in the future. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're wanting a OnePlus 3 but you've yet to pull the trigger, this would be the best time to do so. Because even with the price increase, with all the improvements that you're getting, it still makes this phone the best deal you can get on an Android flagship. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed this review of the OnePlus 3T. If you did, please give it a thumbs up down below and also subscribe to the channel, which is also down below if you haven't already. And check us out on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Google+, all that good stuff will be linked down below. And feel free to follow me on Twitter as well. And as always, keep it tuned here to Android Authority because we are your source for all things Android.